All right. Okay, as Nathan said, we are going to be in the book of Ruth this morning. And this is what we consider maybe like our first small book. Up to this point, all the books have been pretty big, pretty beefy, a lot of information, all that kind of stuff, So, but this time we get to kind of hunker down and focus on these 4 little chapters. And I think it's important that we don't just skip over this book by any means. Well, I think it's a good idea to not skip over any book of the Bible, so don't hear that. But, but specifically Ruth, because I realize it's only 4 chapters, but let's keep in mind that when we talk about the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew 1, Ruth is only one of like 4 women that are mentioned in the entire genealogy. So I think there's some importance there, right? There's a significance there for sure. So let's talk about Ruth a little bit, right? There's a pattern here that I want us to kind of see, all right? Number 1, there's actually a pattern with how Ruth falls in the Bible compared to actually how David and I, when we were kind of talking about, preaching through the Bible and Nathan and everything, we kind of had this same idea. And let me explain. So, and maybe you've noticed, but how we've kind of been doing things is this like flyover style, right? And then every once in a while, we'll dive down and really focus in on a certain aspect of a book. We did not spend a year going through Genesis, right? So we couldn't just hunker down and really get into detail on every tiny little aspect of Genesis, right? We couldn't do that. We didn't have time, right? So we try to do this flyover and we come down and we just touch on these individual stories. And then we go back up and we give the general overview. So we know the overall narrative of the Bible. We know how it's all fitting together. But every once in a while, it's good to slow down and say, but we want to focus on this specific thing, right? Consider that like our preaching hack for the year, okay? That's how it's like, okay, that's how we're going to handle doing the entire Bible, right? That was our train of thought. So with the book of Ruth, we kind of get that same thing. Right? So we have this all these big beefy books and, Genesis and Numbers and Leviticus, all this information. And then we get to Ruth and it's like God is telling us to intentionally, okay, slow down. Slow down for a second. Because instead of talking about the entire nation of Israel and all these intertwining stories, we get to focus in on this one family. This one family that has significance. Okay? And I think that's one important thing with Ruth, is it's God telling, slow down, okay? So just a brief history, okay? So Ruth is the story of a Moabite woman, okay? Her name, right, is the title of the book. So if you're an Israelite and you see this, you're already thinking like, whoa, scandal. Why is a Moabite the star of this book? Right? Like you're already kind of thinking that in your head. Okay? So the Moabites, just again, brief history here, just so we know who we're talking about. They go all the way back to Abraham and Lot, right? You got Abraham, you got Lot. Moabites come from Lot. Lot had 2 sons, Moab, right? And really fun name, Ben-Ammi. Right? This really fun name, okay? And then from those lineages, right, we get the Moabites and the Ammonites. All right? We get those 2 people groups. Now, as we are entering the Promised Land, as the Israelites are entering the Promised Land, these are actually the 2 people groups that God says, don't go to war with them, don't mess with them, that kind of thing. And I think in the ESV it uses the word, don't harass them, which I thought was really interesting. Was really interesting. Don't harass these 2 people groups because of Lot. All right. So now we kind of right. So now we kind of know who we're talking about here a little bit. Everyone kind of remember the story of Balaam when we were talking about that. He tried to curse the Israelites as they were going through, and he couldn't. All he could do was say blessings. Everyone kind of remember that story. Okay, same people. Okay, now we know who we're talking about. These are the Moabites. All right. Again, brief history. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Moabites in 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel. We'll get into them in just a little bit more as we progress. All right. So like I said, we kind of start this book in this scandal because it's the story of a Moabite woman. But if we read Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, we get a lot of information in just this verse. Can we go ahead and pop that one up? So this is Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. Here we go. And there's a lot of information here just in this. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. He and his wife had he and his wife and his 2 sons. All right, so we get a time and we get a setting. And not just one setting, but we actually get 2 different settings just in the first verse. A lot of information here. All right, so when we say that Ruth took place in the time of the judges, that's both specific and very vague, which I understand that comment is both very specific and very vague. But, okay, so when we say the time of the judges, that's like 300 to 400 year time span. Okay, that's a lot of time. So that'd be like saying, Jerry lived in the time of the United States. So that's both, kind of specific because the United States had not been around that long, but also very broad because we're talking everything from Benjamin Franklin to Elon Musk. There's a big difference there, right? There's a lot of cultural changes that would have happened. Big difference, okay? So that both tells you information, but also it's like, okay, so when? Immediately, we understand kind of how the author is going to be setting up this book. Just from that beginning phrase. Ruth took place in the time of the judges is less of a timestamp and more of a cultural commentary. Okay? So that's how we need to think about this. The author is wanting us to understand that the story of Ruth that we're getting ready to read took place in a time of corruption and of evil. Okay? So, yes, like I said, it kind of gives us a time frame. And even then, maybe if you were a big history buff, you could kind of figure out there was a famine in the land. Well, how many famines were there in the 300 to 400 year time span? Maybe there was only 2 or 3. So maybe you could have, honed in on that a little bit more. But ultimately, it doesn't matter. What we need to understand is that the story of Ruth takes place during a time of corruption and evil. And actually, the entire story of Ruth is placed in contrast to the previous book of Judges. There's a lot of events that happen in Ruth that give you a very different picture of that time. A lot of events. We're not going to talk about all of them necessarily, but there was a lot. Okay? Because you got corruption, you got evil that's happening in Judges, and then at the same time, in this book, you have loyalty, faithfulness, and love. Just a very, very flip of the switch here. And I think that's what's important. That's what we need to get at here. Now, the next thing would be both important to Israelites, but also I want to kind of just touch on how important it is to us here, like right now, okay? When we read this and we say, famine and a man of Bethlehem, what's the first thing we think about? What? Jesus, right? That's the first person we're going to think about when we read Bethlehem, right? So right now, just, if we were saying like this was like not written to us, but it is written for us. We want to get something personally out of this. We're like, oh, I know that place. I know that. I've read about that place, right? So our ears are already starting to perk up here. But then you get sojourn in the country of Moab. So now you're an Israelite again, and you're reading this, you'll be like, wait a minute, why are we doing this? Why is he going to Moab? This is ridiculous. Why would he lead his family there? From Bethlehem, can we get that map up there? I want to go ahead and point this out. Okay, everyone see the big circle here? It says Bethlehem. Everyone see that? Purple. There's Moab. Okay? Does that look like a convenient trip? Right? Like you can either come all the way down, get into Edom, which isn't a good idea either, right? Come all the way down, come around, get back into Moab. Or, you know what, I guess you could try to get across the sea, which wasn't always the safest thing to do with your family during that time. Like, does this look like a convenient trip? No. The answer is no, it's not a convenient trip. And even if it was a convenient trip, why would you go there? Right? The Israelites and the Moabites weren't exactly buddies. Like, there's just so much about this. If you were reading, like, this is weird, this doesn't make sense, why would he do that? How bad was this famine that it would have forced them completely out of their country? Right? So you're starting to ask all these questions, and we're only in the first verse. Because it's just a weird setting that we're starting to get ourselves into, right? So yeah, even in the first verse, we're starting to understand, like, okay, how is the author going to set this up? The thing we need to realize too is Ruth is what we're going to call a subplot, or if you're into like video games or something like that, be a side quest. Okay, it supports the overall narrative that we're trying to get at with the Bible, but it can also kind of just stand on its own. Okay, so whenever we're reading through Ruth, that's the reason why we don't see a lot of the same stuff that we would have saw in Judges. So because it's different. It stands on its own, but it's also supporting the main narrative. Okay. Oh, excuse me, very much. Okay, now as we're going through this, man, what we want to realize, even though Ruth is the name of the book, what we're actually seeing here, because we got this weird thing going here, we've got Ruth taking place during an evil, corrupt time and everything. God is actually the star of this book, and we need to remember that. God is the one that is working behind the scenes to orchestrate these events. It's the reason why the subplot exists to begin with. Is because all of this evil and corruption is happening in Judges, and then you have this little book of Ruth that is showing us how God is going to orchestrate these events of a single family, bringing them out for a singular purpose, to lead us to Jesus. Because, spoiler alert, Ruth leads us to David and then follow that lineage all the way to Jesus. And we see God, like I said, orchestrating these events to pull out this family to make this happen. In the midst of evil, God is working everything for our good. We have the story of redemption within the book, but because of it, we get our story of redemption through Jesus Christ. Through scandal, through things that just don't make sense. God is working it out for us. Ruth is planted strategically between Judges and 1 Samuel. It ends, Judges ends with, everyone remember, there is no king in Israel, right? Is how, like the last few chapters, right? It really kind of focuses on that phrase. There is no king in Israel. And then you have Ruth, and then you have 1 Samuel when we start talking about David. Ruth is strategically placed to solidify that David is the king. He's meant to be the king. His lineage is true. His lineage is correct. That's the one that we need to bank on, which then leads us all the way to Jesus Christ. The main thing we need to understand too is that there are actually 3 different redeemers in the book of Ruth. And the number one we've already kind of talked about is God. He is the number one star redeemer of the book. I understand Ruth is on the title, but the story's about God. Okay? Number 2 is Ruth. And then number 3 is this guy that we meet in chapter 2 called Boaz. So he gets this nifty title called the Kinsman Redeemer, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. We actually are going to have a special guest up here in the next, 1 minute. Sarah's going to come up here and give us her little unique perspective on the book of Ruth. She's going to let me come up and embarrass her, which is going to be really fun. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the character of Ruth and things like that when she gets up here. Right now I just want to continue to unpack some of the more of the cultural aspects of it. But so we have God, we have Ruth, and we have Boaz. And now Boaz is often seen as the person who kind of rescues the family, redeems the family. And I think just so we understand, the word redeem, especially like right now, we think redeem, we think, yes, Jesus redeemed me. He is my redeemer. And it's this emotional word that we but in the basic form, redeem just simply means to pay a debt. Okay, that's just kind of just basic understanding. Let's just kind of get there, right? If I go to the house, or if I go to the bank and pay off my house, I have redeemed my house from the bank. Okay, that's just a basic way to think about it. So whenever Boaz comes and he's going to redeem the family farm and stuff like that, that's what he's saying, right? He's literally buying property and everything like that. That's basically what we need to understand. Now, with Boaz, we do get the added bonus that he gets Ruth, right, with that, and then that starts the whole line. But he redeems not only the property, but he redeems the family through a marriage, and we get that more like in Ruth 3. But the thing that we're going to unpack whenever Sarah gets up here is how Ruth fits into that, okay, as actually the number 2 redeemer in the story, and how she ends up, it's not just her loyalty to Naomi, but it's actually her faith that is the driving force of that. So with that, I am going to go ahead and invite Sarah to come up as she grins at me. I told her, I was like, I can do this. I can get my part done in 15 minutes. Watch me do it. And yeah. Have a seat.
Are we moving down here?
Yeah. What she doesn't know is I still have another 4-page of notes. Let's get over though.
I need a microphone.
That one.
Where are you putting?
There.
Do we need to?
Yeah. All right. Everyone invite Sarah up again. I'm going to sit down. I was tired. All right. Hi.
Hi.
You ready for this?
Sure.
Yeah, should be. All right. Okay, so what was it, about 2 or 3 years ago is when you probably first really read through Ruth, right? And so what would you think was your first main takeaway there? What was your first overall impression the first time you read it?
The book's just relatable. I could just relate to a lot of things in it, because when you look at why Naomi and Elimelech left, it was a famine. They needed to feed their kids. That was relatable. I don't even know if I had the kids yet, but you can say, oh, they needed to feed their kids. They had to leave. There was a famine. And so that was just relatable to me. And so they left town. David brought up a couple weeks ago, we would lose our minds if we went to the store and didn't have strawberries. Like, if a whole of Jeff City didn't have strawberries, we'd be like, what's going on? They didn't have food, any food, so they left town. When all 3 men died, later on in the story, maybe you don't have, your supporter passing away, but you can relate that 3 close family members had just passed away. You feel their pain, both Ruth and Naomi, and I want to call her Oprah, but it's not. Orpah, yeah. Every time I read her name, it's Oprah in my head, so it just doesn't come out right. But as you keep reading, you can read that God is faithful. You see it. You see how at the end it's been redeemed, and God is faithful even through the tragedy. And we've all had our tragedy. Some people's valleys are lower than others, but not everyone's are. And so you feel like, oh, they were redeemed from the lowest, one of the lowest of the lows, because they didn't have a man in their life to help them, and God still had a plan for them. Mm-hmm. I found it amazing when Ruth followed Naomi, because Naomi didn't say, hey, come back home with me. It's going to be great. There's so much in my hometown that it's going to be great. Just come on. I've got a house. No, it was faith and trust. There was no stability promised. There was, it was a hard decision to go, or I assume it would have been a hard decision. And at that point, when Naomi said, go back to your gods, it didn't say go back to Yahweh. She said, go back to your God. So at that point, we have to assume that Ruth probably was a baby Christian.
Yeah, I think it's good to take the time right here maybe to unpack that a little bit, because we were talking what you said, Ruth was a baby Christian, and there's actually in Ruth 1 at the very end there, like around verse 17, when Naomi is kind of making her final plea, like go back, don't follow me and everything. So God's mentioned a couple times in there, but both names are mentioned. Right, and I think Tara Lee, right, from Bible Craft kind of mentioned this, I think. And so this isn't like some groundbreaking thing that Adam and Sarah figured out, and now we're Sarah. But it's important enough to repeat, right? So it was this idea like, go back to your God, but then also Ruth said, your God will be my God. But they're using the term Elohim, right, which is like the generic God, the person, the deity, and everything. But then it turns around and Ruth says, Lord, Lord, and Yahweh, right? So it's this aspect, Ruth has a personal relationship. So there's a shift there. It's not just a change in, well, this God isn't working, so I'm going to move to this one. There's something else going on there. So, And then one thing that we've been obviously talking about this, this whole week and everything. One thing that we talked about is like, okay, so how did Ruth get there?
Right.
And we didn't want to pull something out of the Bible that wasn't there. But
you could assume that either that one of the her husband, her brother-in-law, or her father-in-law, or Naomi were pouring into her. All four of them were pouring into her, but probably in the end, it was only Naomi pouring into her. So maybe Naomi didn't think she was doing a good job, saying, "Hey, you don't believe me, go back." But there was a seed planted, and that took root in Ruth.
Yeah, and and Ruth doesn't. The book Ruth does not dive into that. It doesn't really unpack that for us or anything like that.
But there's a change.
But there's a change.
There was your God, and then nope, I'm following your God.
Yeah, there's definitely a faith thing, which then is what we see the rest of the book follow that. Because of a heart change, because of a change in faith, we see Ruth's actions change to match that, right? So what changed this time? When you read it through this time as opposed to 2 to 3 years ago, what changed?
This time I really liked how we just read Judges. There's so much context, background context that was added that, in the time of the Judges, the first time didn't mean anything to me. Now it means so much more of, it wasn't an easy place. You kind of touched on that already, though. It was corruption was happening. And then I wanted to scream, "You're leaving? What?" But you mentioned that too. But I'm like, why are you leaving? Moses said, "Do not go."
Yeah.
And you're leaving. And you have 2 sons that are going to need a wife. Where do you think they're going to get the wife? Reading it in conjunction with Judges was different this time. And we already talked about that one.
Which one?
That paragraph, so I'm good. You brought that up earlier.
Well, notes are meant to be broken, as they say. Okay. All right. So the real reason why, obviously I got you up here is, I don't know if anyone notices, but I'm actually not a woman. But my wife is. Weird how that works. But so from a woman's perspective, that's really what I wanted to get here. What do you see as one of the significances of the book?
That God did not promise roses and sunshine, happy days all the time. He said, "I will be by your side." And Ruth follows Naomi, but also leans on God for that. We have to trust in his promise that he will be with us. He will be our guidance, and to follow the Holy Spirit. It doesn't specifically talk about the Holy Spirit, but with everything that's been going on, all the mundane events, the little events that took place, like the Holy Spirit was leading them. And it's at every turn, at the end of every chapter, I think is what Tara Lee says, but Ruth and Naomi come back together and they praise God for the small steps, everything little. They didn't know when she went in the field that Boaz was going to find favor in her, but he did. And so just all the mundane small steps, but that God provided when they lost all 3 men in their life, and God still provided and brought them up and gave them one heck of a genealogy.
Yeah. Just kind of follow up with that. So what would, if you were wanted to say, this is the direct message I wanted to give Hannah,
She didn't hear that.
Yeah, no, she didn't. But to give to Hannah or any other mother to daughter type of relationship, that kind of thing, what would you want them to hear there?
That Ruth is a noble character. It's someone you can look towards and learn from. She chose the hard path. And was greatly rewarded. I'm not saying the hard path, you have to have a hard path to be rewarded, but she didn't choose the easy path of just going back home to her mom and dad and her gods where she knew people. She could have probably easier found a husband potentially. She chose the hard path of going away, not knowing anyone, potentially never seeing her family again, and she was rewarded.
But you mentioned the idea of the noble character, and I know that was part of our discussion, was this idea of noble character, but what was virtuous, right? Yep. The virtuous woman and everything. And what was really cool and actually this was just this morning that I kind of made this connection, was so Boaz, when we first get introduced to him in Ruth 2, he is described as a worthy man. And the other time that we hear that particular term is actually back in Judges, in the story of Gideon. And it's whenever, maybe you remember this or not, but it's that phrase, mighty man of valor. Mighty men of valor, because at that point it was plural. And it was, this term of endearment and everything, right? So the word there is actually Gibor. And whenever Boaz is described as a worthy man, it's actually the same language. It's the same term. So this idea of mighty man of valor or a worthy man, it's the same language. And then here's the really cool connection here, is the virtuous woman is also, it's the same language. It's all the same language there. So God's kind of making this connection there, and which is directly connected with Proverbs 31, right? So now I know you wrote down a few scriptures from Proverbs 31 that you wanted to just kind of talk about real quick. So,
all right. So I defined virtuous woman because I needed that in my world, and so virtuous just means behavior showing high morals, and so we've got
it's a
slide. That's what I'm trying to go to.
Proverbs 31 slide.
So if you look and just go read Proverbs 31 at the very beginning, read Ruth and read that, you're like, well, Ruth doesn't show all those. And no, Ruth does not show all Proverbs 31 virtuous women scriptures. She doesn't yet. I believe by the end of her life, she does. But at the very beginning, she does not. There are definitely ways that she does. It's not there. She rises while it is yet night and provides food for her household and portions for her maidens. She provides food for Naomi over and over. Hey, go to this field. She works hard. She provides. She has strength to persevere because I'm not sure I could do everything she did. She just keeps going. Again, we've kind of talked about that. She's showing the willingness to help the needy and the poor. She was needy and poor, and she said, "Oh, I'm still going to help the needy and poor." It's not. She didn't just sit down and whine and say, "Oh, poor me." She took charge of it. She didn't leave Naomi alone when she was stuck to give her. Naomi would have been stuck had Ruth. We didn't touch on that. Naomi would have been stuck if Ruth didn't go with her. She didn't have a husband and she didn't have any sons, so there would have been no one to care for her. So Ruth stuck by her and also gave her a grandson in return, and provided her food and was her redeemer.
Yeah.
A different. I want to go back to this. Boaz. When Boaz is talking about Ruth, he only talks about her character, her strength. He praises her for her work. Ruth could have talked a different way, dressed a different way the whole time. She knew she needed to get a husband, but that's not what she did. She just continued to worked hard, kind of stuck to herself a little bit, and that's what Boaz talks about, or the author talks about, was just her heart, how she shows it. And allows God's work to be done.
So there's the slides that Sarah just kind of,
the scriptures that I thought helped define Ruth. And not all Proverbs 31 does at the beginning. Right,
but these are just the specific ones, right, for sure. So, is there any other just final thoughts that you wanted to touch on, or?
I think we hit them all.
Okay, so the other thing that I know just in our conversation that we wanted people to know was how Ruth and her character and how all of that, it leads us, not only what she was, like Sarah was saying, like it leads us to look at her as an example, but also, how I was saying earlier, how Ruth fits into the overall narrative and kind of solidifies, the lineage of David that sends us to Jesus and everything, and how all of that connects. And I think that's one of the things that makes the book of Ruth so interesting, is how it has those two different levels in 4 chapters. It's a powerful book in that way. We see just through her character, through all of that, we see, the love, the faithfulness, the all that kind of stuff, the kind of character that, we would like to see in ourselves and everything, but we see it in the midst of chaos and, corruption and evil, and we see all of that, and it's this direct point of how redemption works, right? Because as all of that was going on, God set forth a series of events that would eventually redeem us in that same fashion. Jesus would come and he would see all of that, and in the midst of all the Roman stuff that was happening during that time, in the midst of all that evil, Nathan kind of touched on it a little bit actually in his call to worship, where Jesus came in peace. He could have came very differently, but he came in peace during a time of evil and all that, right? And we see that. And as it continues down that lineage, down that story, we see God, how he orchestrates our redemption, how he orchestrates it through peace, not war, and all of that. And I just think that how the story just keeps going with that is just super interesting to me. So we wanted to leave with this idea of how to practically apply what we learn from Ruth and apply it practically, right? So that's with the story of Ruth and Naomi and how they interact, right? So Naomi was pretty hopeless.
Oh, yeah.
Pretty hopeless, right? And
she may not have been right at the beginning, losing your husband. Okay, well, I still have 2 sons, and then she lost both sons.
Yeah. Well, she changes her name.
Mara.
To Mara, right?
Means bitterness.
The bitterness, right. And Ruth stuck with her through all of that, right?
Yeah, she might not have been I never thought about it. She probably wasn't a very fun person to be around at that point.
Probably not, for sure. But Ruth stuck with her, And I think just how we see Ruth interact with Naomi is what we would like everyone to just kind of take away from the book. Is when you see someone that is hopeless, when you see someone that's low and down and everything, how does our faith compel us to interact with that person? And I think that Galatians 6:2 is where we go with that, and that's bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. And so whenever you're thinking this week and you're praying for someone and someone comes to mind and everything, you're praying with them, and how else do you bear that burden with that person? Learn from Ruth. Ruth obviously took major action in how she bared that burden. But ask God. Ask God how you should help and bear that burden with someone else. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to move to another country. Ask him. He's going to be able to help you through that through his Spirit. So, Sarah, thank you. We're going to go ahead and transition this out to a time of response. So thank you for coming up. Let's go ahead and move this out of the way too. Yeah. Okay, like I said, we're going to go ahead and really thank Sarah for coming up and kind of giving her perspective on that. We're going to go ahead and move into our response time. And just kind of some final thoughts here. Guys, when we're reading small books like this, I think the tendency, especially when we get into the New Testament, there's going to be this this is a little book, this isn't going to mean much, or we're going to just read through it real quick. Or you might be relieved, only one book this day or this week, right? You're going to get to that. But a lot of times, if you just take the time and slow down, just like Ruth, it kind of feels like this intentional slow down in the overall narrative. If you take the time to do that, you're going to find that these little books actually have a lot of meat, and a lot of really good stuff. Because, Ruth is what leads us directly to Jesus, and directly that, he is ultimately our Redeemer. And we see this different level of redemption just throughout the story of Ruth, leading us directly to him. So just to kind of reiterate this practical idea of just praying for someone else this week and thinking, man, Lord, lead me to help bear a burden with somebody. Naomi just felt absolutely hopeless, and Ruth was just there for her. In the very practical sense, how can we just be there for somebody? How can we pray for them? How can we bear that burden with them? So as we use the character of Ruth as just kind of an example this morning, and as we're responding to our music, and just think through that and kind of pray through that, and maybe God has someone that he wants to lay on your heart this morning.